The final shape is right around the corner, and with it comes a whole new set of prismatic subclasses for us to sink our teeth into. And unlike how Strand and Stasis were handled in previous expansions, we'll be able to fully run around with these new subclasses equipped for basically the entire campaign, which is pretty sweet. Since Warlock is my main class, I thought I'd give you guys a quick breakdown of the full prismatic build that I will be running for maybe the entire legendary campaign, just in case you guys want to run something similar as well. Now, the starting prismatic kits here are a bit limited. Warlocks basically only have access to stasis and void abilities. However, that's more than enough to give us a pretty crazy gameplay loop to work off of. Before we get into things, just a quick explainer for really anyone trying to build a prismatic loadout in Final Shape. At the bottom here under your super bar, you're going to notice there's two smaller bars that you need to fill up in order to access Transcendence, which is basically a mini super that turns you into this crazy ability spamming machine. The core of any prismatic build should be centered around being transcended as frequently as possible. The way you fill up these bars is by either dealing damage, picking up elemental buffs, or applying elemental debuffs. More specifically, you need to be harmonized between your light and darkness powers. In the case of this build, we will largely be leaning around the combination of void and stasis powers. Starting with our super, I went with Cataclysm Nova Bomb as I prefer the single target damage over ad clear for our super, and Nova got a slight buff this season, so might as well. We're using Phoenix Dive for our class ability for an easy cure ×2 on command, and it also allows us to be a bit more mobile with a much lower base cooldown to boot. For our melee, we're using the newly buffed Pocket Singularity, and for our grenade, we're going to need to have Cold Snap grenades. These will be paired with our first aspect, which is Bleakwatcher, allowing us to convert those grenades into stasis turrets to help us freeze and slow enemies in the battlefield. Now, Bleakwatchers are mainly for CC, but they do in fact do a little bit of damage as well, and my hope is these will be more than enough to cover most of the darkness damage we need for Transcendence. We'll also be making use of the Osmiomancy gloves to give us a second grenade charge and give our cold snaps better tracking as well. Remember, no exotic class items until after the day 1 raid clear, but once they're out, definitely try and snag yourself the combo of Osmiomancy and Star Eaters for this build. Now, this is where things start to really go off the rails, because our second aspect is Feed the Void, which grants us Devour on ability kills, and yes, that includes defeating slowed and frozen targets from our Bleakwatcher turrets. This aspect also makes it so anytime we reproc Devour, we'll also be getting a chunk of grenade energy back as well. I'm telling you guys, we may have the ultimate infinite stasis turret build on our hands here, and this build is just getting started. We also get 5 starting fragments to work with here. First is Facet of Dawn, which is basically Ember of Torches from the solar subclasses, so we'll now be adding Radiant to this loadout as well. Speaking of Radiant, Facet of Hope gives us added class ability regen whenever we have an elemental buff. I don't think Devour counts for this, but if it does, that's going to be pretty sweet. Facet of Protection gives us 25% damage resistance while surrounded by enemies, and Facet of Ruin increases the size and damage burst from shattering stasis crystals and frozen enemies. Finally, we have Facet of Purpose, which will give us a void overshield anytime we pick up an orb of power. Before we get into our weapons, just a reminder that if you want to see more build guides like this one in the Final Shape, then feel free to leave a like and sub down below, and let me know in the comments what prismatic combos are you most excited to see. Now, there's 2 exotic weapons that I think are really great for this build. The first one is Buried Bloodline, the exotic rocket sidearm from Warlord's Ruin. Its main perk gives Devour on multi-kills, which plays perfectly into our gameplay loop here. Not only that, the catalyst also weakens targets on hit, which means this build has easy access to both a buff and debuff at all times. But I know not everyone has this gun, so a fantastic alternative that everyone should have is Graviton Lance. This gun is getting a slight nerf to its splash damage, but I'm going to bet that that's not going to be very noticeable. What will be noticeable is the added 15% damage buff versus red bar enemies this thing's getting. This gun is just straight up one of the best ad clear exotics in the entire game. It is a monster. We definitely want a stasis weapon, so I went with the Riptide with auto-loading and shield clip. Shield clip is getting reworked slightly this season, so if you have a solid deliverance laying around, then that's a great option as well. We also have 2 options to work with in our heavy slot. First is this crafted commemoration with reconstruction and killing tally, which will just absolutely chew through groups of enemies with ease. But you're definitely not going to want to use this thing in a boss fight, so for boss encounters, you probably want a void weapon, and there's no better pick right now than Edge Transit with Envious Assassin and Bait and Switch. Looking at the episode 1 artifact, obviously you won't have this fully unlocked immediately, but there are several mods here that really take this build to another level entirely. In the first column, we have Unstoppable Sidearm and Anti-Barrier Pulse Rifle, depending on which of the 2 exotic primaries you're using. In column 3, we have Elemental Siphon, which will create a Void Breach anytime you get a multi-kill with a Void weapon. In that column, we also have Creeping Chill, which will give us a slowing burst by killing slowed targets with our fusion rifle. In column 4, we get Void Hegemony, which grants a Void Overshield for defeating weakened targets. turrets. So if you're running Buried Bloodline, that's basically an infinite overshield as well. We'll also be getting infinite radiant as well, as the mod Radiant Orbs gives you that 25% damage buff anytime you pick up an Orb of Power. And then finally in the 5th column we get Expanding Abyss, granting even more damage against weakened targets. So just to recap here, we get infinite weaken, infinite devour, infinite overshields, and infinite radiant. This build is going to be absolutely absurd. For stats, you definitely want to max out your resilience and discipline, with the rest of your stats just being dumped into recovery. Looking at our mod setup here, and this is all designed around grenade ability regen. The more stasis turrets we can get out on the field, the better. I'll leave a dim link below to the build you're seeing on screen, so you can have these mods and weapons ready to go when the final shape drops on Tuesday. By the way, speaking of those exotic class items, I did an entire video on some of the most broken combos we have available with those things, so you can check that video out right here.